Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for this wonderful program. My name is Kristen Antelman. I'm University Librarian, and we're so happy to have you here with us this evening for our second annual Early Recordings Initiative event. For those of you who joined us for last year's event, which you can find on YouTube, I believe. Anyway, there's a recording. If you search our website, you'll find it. It was fantastic. So you know tonight you're in for another wonderful evening of discovery and knowledge sharing around the history of recorded sound, which is one of the hallmark areas of UCSB's special collections collecting. So the library exists to support research and scholarship for the UCSB community and beyond. Our special research collections is renowned for its diverse and broad collections of important historical materials that are stewarded and cared for by our curators, and two of them, David Soibert and Angel Diaz, are here with us tonight. And because we're a public institution, these primary source materials are available for anyone who wants to access them. Our performing arts collection in particular has an extraordinary collection of early recorded sound on both cylinders and Berliner discs. Under the leadership of David Soibert, this collection has flourished and greatly influenced scholarship, creative pursuits, and other related research in the field of historical recordings and beyond. The Early Recordings Initiative is a unique public-private partnership that was designed to ensure these historical artifacts are preserved for generations to come. The Early Recordings Initiative, ERI, was envisioned by collector and donor John Levin, whom you'll hear from in a moment, in order to promote the preservation, accessibility, understanding, and appreciation of pre-1903 sound recordings. Anchored by the John Levin Early Recordings Fund, the initiative is focused on the acquisition, conservation, maintenance, digitization, and study of the earliest and rarest sound recordings. Each year, we're committed to hosting an event around ERI-related topics to support these efforts. And events like the one here tonight illuminate the value of maintaining historical objects, not only as artifacts of the past, but also as resources that can deeply influence the future. Take, for example, the phonographic cylinder and the gramophone record. You see your records here. While the two formats existed simultaneously in the late 1800s, the record eventually became the leading format for music reproduction, and incredibly remains vibrant more than 130 years later. I myself have a nice LP collection at home. I will never be giving up. It's modest compared to what I'm sure John's is. But before our panelists begin, I want to thank John for his commitment to the preservation of early recorded sound, and also for his genuine partnership in developing this collection area for future generations of researchers and music history lovers alike. In addition to establishing the initiative, John has also created a legacy gift where the library will eventually receive his impressive collection of early cylinders and discs, making UCSB the preeminent repository for early sound recordings. Please join me in thanking John and his wife, Pat, for their commitment and long-term investment in the library. And thank you again for being with us tonight. And welcome to our virtual audience of over at least 100 participants and maybe many more, maybe even 150 or more, who are joining us via Zoom. So now I would like to introduce our friend and partner, John Levin.
So I think it's really fitting that a technology-rooted presentation begins with a technology glitch. It's axiomatic, and everybody on this panel is very familiar with them, and you'll be familiar with some tonight as we struggle with our slides. Start with a story. I've got a friend, Mark, and about 30 years ago, he made a wonderful documentary about collecting early phonographs and records. It's called Talking Furniture. It's hard to find, but it's out there. And it opens with a series of short sound bites. And my favorite was a tight close-up of a guy with a handlebar mustache. And he says, if it's not round with a red label, I'm not interested in it. So I asked Mark, I said, when you interviewed him, what did you ask him? Mark said, I asked him if he was married. It's funny, right? But it's also telling. because analog sound, mostly music, it's not just entertainment or background for some of us. It's an actual, absolute, completely consuming passion. And I know by some of the smiles I see out there that I'm not the only one who feels that way about it. Because music is pervasive, a near constant background today, it's easy to detach from it and to lose that deeply human, deeply emotional response that we have. But it's there. And the resurgent popularity of vinyl today has clarified that underlying emotional power that's associated with analog music listening. I'm actually not sure this is a new phenomenon. I think it's possible that the magic that we attribute to analog listening now was actually always there, but it was just too submerged and too subtle to be felt and understood, particularly back when that's all there was when it came to reproduced music. Anyway, today you're going to get to be the judge of that as this, this panel of sound professionals walk, or rather run, through the entire 130-year history of the disc record. You're going to hear a bunch of recordings that don't sound like the real thing. That is, they don't sound like musicians performing in this room. They never did. But even though they're facsimiles, there are moments when you might feel them tug at you. If so, I want you to hold on to that feeling, hold it, and remember that what the guy said in Mark's documentary about passion. Now David Soibert will tell you more.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is David Soibert, and I'm the curator of the Performing Arts Collection here at the UCSB Library. I'm going to start by telling a little story. In 1985, I used the proceeds from my summer job mowing lawns to buy the latest consumer technology, a CD player. The CD set out to supplant the dominance of the vinyl LP record with a superior digital playback technology. And it did. By 2005, LPs had virtually disappeared from the consumer marketplace. But then a funny thing happened. Sales began to creep back up. You could buy new LPs at Urban Outfitters and Whole Foods and Target. And by 2022, LPs were outselling CDs again. But if you stop by my house today, you'll no longer find a CD player, and the CDs are in boxes in the basement. But you will find 3 or 4 LP turntables and a couple of other devices for playing back historical formats. And I'm not necessarily an outlier because I'm a professional sound archivist. Analog discs have somehow captured people's imagination again, and today we'll explore why and look at their history. But first, I'd like to thank John Levin for proposing the panel today and for founding and supporting the Early Recordings Initiative here at UCSB. Working with John to explore how to reach audiences like you and teach about the value of sound recordings never gets old. And next, I'd like to introduce the moderator of today's panel, Yuri Shimoda. My friend and colleague Yuri has a degree from UCLA's Media Archiving program and is the head of preservation services now for Warner Brothers Discovery in Los Angeles. She is also president-elect of the Association for Recorded Sound Collections. She will introduce our panelists today. Thank you, Yuri, and welcome, everybody. And I think we need to take a quick pause for fixing the media. Thank you.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you, John. We have an amazing evening in store for you all here and at home. At home, please feel free to utilize the Zoom chat to converse with one another, and also put your questions, and I will be posing them to the panelists at the end of today's event. We're going to begin talking about the beginnings of the format and kind of explore the format war between disc and cylinder, And taking us through that early beginning is Richard Martin, co-owner, producer, engineer, researcher, writer for Archeophone Records. The reissue label that is focused on rescuing and preserving the world's oldest sounds alongside original contextualizing research. Then we will move into the electric age, the 1920s, and into the modern, what everyone knows as modern vinyl LPs. And Nicholas Bergh will be taking us into that era. Nick is a sound restoration expert and founder of Endpoint Audio Labs in Burbank, California. Endpoint focuses on improving the quality of sound transfers before restoration. Endpoint has become known for both unique transfer technologies as well as using historical research to inform transfer decisions. And then we will really talk about the initial popularity of vinyl LPs, and then the waning of the format, and eventually the re-emergence into the modern era today. And taking us through that examination is Patrick Feaster, sound media historian and lead researcher of the First Sounds Initiative. Patrick has been actively involved in locating, making audible, and contextualizing many of the world's oldest sound recordings. So thank you all for being here, and you all for being present. So let's go ahead and turn things over to Rich.
Thanks, Yuri. A number of people have pointed out something that isn't common knowledge, which is that the disc and the cylinder started at the same time. Most people think the cylinder was first and then it was the disc, but that's not true. In fact, Edison, who invented the phonograph, foresaw the use of discs as practical substitutes for his preferred cylindrical media. In his seminal phonograph patent, which you see here, filed in December of 1877, granted in February of 78, he writes, quote, "It is obvious that many forms of mechanism may be used to give motion to the material to be indented. For instance, a revolving plate may have a volute spiral cut both on its upper and lower surfaces, on the top of which the foil or indenting material is laid and secured in a proper manner." Nevertheless, Edison didn't pursue the development of the disc as an alternative at that juncture. He actually abandoned the phonograph altogether to concentrate on his electric light, for which we give thanks. Into the vacuum that arose in the early 1880s entered a name you're familiar with, Alexander Graham Bell, his cousin Chichester Bell, and physicist Charles Sumner Tainter. And they developed the graphophone in their Volta laboratory. They experimented with a lot of different formats, including cardboard and glass and metal, to see what would be the best medium for taking recordings. And they finally landed on a narrow 6-inch cardboard tube coated with a thin layer of resin. It's called ozocarat wax. Edison, as you can imagine, was outraged. He thought this was theft, and he quickly got back in the game. But he didn't take any notice of a German immigrant in Washington, D.C. named Emil Berliner, who had recently sold to the Bell Company a lucrative microphone patent for use in the telephone. The year was 1886. Relatively wealthy after the sale of the patent, he could now experiment. And he sought to solve the problems that had plagued the graphophone's records. They had low volume, they had a proclivity for wearing out, and an inability to be duplicated. So he filed for 2 patents in 87 for the gramophone. And then in 1888, Berliner and his workshop mechanic, a man named Werner Suess from Leipzig, had a breakthrough. Here's the process by which disc records were originally made. Quote, it's very technical. The polished surface of a zinc sheet was first coated with a thin layer of beeswax dissolved in benzene, which was resistant to acid. After the solvent evaporated, the sheet was ready for the recording process, during which the stylus of the recorder, attached to a mica diaphragm, scratched the sound groove into the wax layer, exposing the bare metal. This process took place in an alcohol bath to prevent the wax chips from sticking to the stylus and impairing the groove. In the subsequent etching process, which took about 20 minutes, the acid actually bit into the metal where it was exposed, leaving behind grooves sunk into the zinc sheet. After cleaning, the zinc master was playable. End quote. Berliner returned to his native Hanover in 1889 for further R&D, and he also attempted to gain backers for his new business. And in September 1890, he publicly launched E. Berliner's gramophone. The first disc products were 12.5 centimeter discs, almost 5 inches, made of a hard rubber called gutta percha. And the discs were recorded in many different languages: English, German, French, Spanish, Italian, and more. The repertoire on the discs included the kinds of material that you would already know, like prayers, nursery rhymes, and other children's songs, poetry. So when you heard it, you thought you were hearing more than was actually determinable. But there was also music, things like solo performances of clarinet, piano, and cornet. But they were noisy, they were distorted, and because they were hand-wound, both in the process of recording them and in playing them back, very unsteady, they wavered wildly in pitch. In 2021, Archeophone Records, my company, with my wife and partner Megan Hennessy and our colleagues Stefan Puy and David Giovannoni, released Etching the Voice, Emil Berliner, in the first commercial gramophone discs, which includes restorations of 100 of these rare discs, more than half of the total believed to exist, presenting these artifacts in a restored, superior-sounding way than anyone in the world had ever heard them up to that point, including the people alive at the time. Etching the Voice was commended with 2 Grammy nominations. Yay, our team. Now I'm going to play you one of these so you can see what it sounds like. It's a track called Gasparone. You have the front and the back of the disc here. The first 30 seconds will be raw, straight off the disc. And about 30 seconds in, you'll hear it switch to a slightly restored version where the pops and clicks have been removed and rumble and some other things. And then it'll start over because it's very short. And when it starts over, it'll have been completely restored. The pitch fluctuations will have been removed, and it's like night and day. So let's see what that sounds like. So this is wrong. It's all over the place. Okay. Remove some of the noise. Some of the life comes out of it. But it's still a fun house of mirrors. And now here's the released version. Stable. What do we think? Sound okay? Would you dare say enjoyable? just so long as we put the restoration muscle in. Yeah. So that's where we started in 1889 and up through about 1894. That's the status of disc technology. But we're going to see some improvements. I thought you might enjoy actually hearing what the competition sounded like at the time. What did a cylinder from 1890 or 1891 actually sound like? Well, here's a good example from the Levin collection. Now the flutter has to be pulled out of these two, to be fair. But the depth and the fidelity are just remarkable. Well, we could listen all night. So clearly the cylinder had an edge, right? But don't think for a second that quality was, or would ever be the sole deciding factor, right? That's a subject to which we will return. In any event, Berliner let his business in Germany founder. He returned to the U.S. and started over. I want to remind you, though, another thing that we forget about the earliest days. The phonograph and the graphophone, marketed by the North American Phonograph Company, were sold as business machines. The entertainment, pre-recorded entertainment, was a side business, basically an aftermarket bonus for owners of phonographs. The Edison people didn't even take it seriously until the orders rolled in and they couldn't keep up. The phonograph had dual functionality. It could both record and play back. It was first and foremost a dictation machine, as we see here, labor-saving machine for law offices. Secondarily, it was an entertainment device. And I think you can imagine at the time, if you're interested in one of these things, you heard a lovely track like we just heard, and you say, well, I want one of those. And they said, well, you know, you can make home recordings too. You can send a letter to your relatives in Ireland. And they're like, I don't like my relatives in Ireland. You know, nobody in County Kerry has a phonograph. So the phonograph and graphophone people are selling something that a lot of people didn't need or want. And that's one of Berliner's first insights. He ditched the dual functionality. And set the tone for winning the format wars. I'm calling it streamlined functionality, just the playback. And I think over time, it was be proved that he read the market correctly. I mean, occasionally these things pop up, the Presto disc machines and CDRs and open reel and cassettes, but only a few people really buy into that stuff. The quality of Berliner's output from 1894 to 1900 wasn't much better than his original 5-inch discs, except that pitch fluctuations were reduced dramatically by the use of an electric motor. But the playing field started to level in the late 1890s with the introduction of the Berliner trademark, an affordable, compact, spring-powered machine. Now, what we're looking at here is Edison's original phonograph. Very complex, as you can see. That's an acid battery on the left. You know, no thank you. The trademark is very simple, and it's going to appeal to a different class of consumers. And it was widely adopted pretty quickly there in the late 90s. And on the cylinder side, Columbia and Edison would follow suit, also coming online with very cheap, consumer-friendly markets. So game on. This would be a good time to see what the trademark and associated machines sounded like, and John's going to give us a demo.
So
Do you need the...
this machine is the predecessor of the trademark. And I'm not going to play all of this. You'll know why. Whoops.
You have to give it juice. Thank you. So, is it on? Can you hear me? No? It's on. So, for this next part, I need my assistant. Come on up. Because I want to show and tell, and I only have two hands, and one of them has a microphone in it. I would say that one of the second most obvious, this is Megan Hennessy. Everyone say hello. The second most obvious advantage that the disc had was what I would call enhanced portability and storability, which may not be a word, but it will be after this. Would you take the show and tell? If you're let's say you decide you want to start collecting records in the 1890s, which format will you go for? Cylinders or discs? Well, here's what you've got for a modest cylinder collection. You want to go to your friend's house, you carry around this box, you got to be really careful. If they knock around, they'll break. It's a problem. It's a storage problem too. On the other hand, if you want to become a disc collector, look at this. It's like a photograph album, right, Patrick?
Right.
And, you can put in 7, 8, 10, 12 records, and they all fit. You put it on your shelf, or over time, the cabinets that came with the machines would have space for those. So thank you. There may be more. So that is a definite advantage too. Finally, there is the question of durability. Now, this is a wax cylinder that I'm not going to open up. If I drop this on the floor, it's going to bust. The disc, on the other hand, if I drop this on the floor, it's going to bust too. But there are, Dave Soybert is freaking out. There are other types of durability. With a wax cylinder, if you hold it too tightly, you could break it in your hands. If your paw is too hot, you could break it. And in terms of playback, any playback on particularly the earliest cylinders is extremely damaging. Whereas discs, they'll hold up a little bit longer. So that's another plus. And this would be a good time to talk about the question of scale. None of this would matter if we couldn't achieve scale, which didn't happen until 1902 with real mass reproduction in both the cylinder and the disc world. Really, the lack of reproducibility was probably the biggest peril facing the business. You could stamp out a number of copies of a Berliner, but not many, and the stampers would wear out. A major advance came in 1900 with the use of wax masters instead of acid-etched zinc, which was an innovation of Berliner's associate Eldridge Johnson, who went on to found the Victor Talking Machine Company and become the leader in disc manufacture. The whole business, unfortunately, was almost done in by rivalry and jealousy. As brilliant an investor as Berliner was, he didn't have a knack for business. His original gramophone partnership in Europe blew up, as we saw, and his second enterprise here in the U.S. Nearly went under, or did suffer ignominy. His exclusive sales agent was a man named Frank Seaman, an ad man of great talents, but he didn't like the way Berliner did business, and so he quit and set up a competing business, selling discs and zonophones. And what followed was years of acrimonious legal lawsuits, and the outcome was to simplify. Seaman was enjoined, Berliner was liquidated, and Johnson became the successor to the gramophone patents and was, at the end of the day, the victor, which is what he named his company. Some people think that's why he named it, but we're not sure. So the final section I'm responsible for is trying to get to the bottom of this format war. There's just a couple more minutes here. You remember when I said that quality wasn't always the last word? This was certainly the case when it came to the cylinder market of the late 1890s. Columbia emerged as the leader at the end of the decade, and in 1898 they flexed their muscle by signing all the top recording talent to an exclusive one-year contract. With near monopoly status, Columbia needed to ramp up supply. Well, how did they do it? By using inferior duplicating methods, resulting in noticeably noisier, more distorted records. The earliest cylinder product of the early 1890s was vastly better than that which came at the end of the decade. But we've seen this a million times, right? Cell phones, right? Remember when landlines were pretty good? And then we decided, no, it's better to go the convenient route. And it took years for cell phones to get to the quality that we were already used to from the landlines. So let's compare the fruits of the different formats again as they stood in the late decade. What we're going to have here is a little mashup of Stars and Stripes Forever from 3 different recordings. The first is going to be a 7-inch Berliner disc like the one that John just played. The second one, we don't have the cylinder, so I put the sheet music, will be an 1897 cylinder, and the third will be a 1901 Victor disc with the dog. See if you can appreciate the differences. This is actually the first recording made about 2 weeks after it was copyrighted. So now this is the cylinder by Seuss's Grand Concert Room. It's got a fuller sound. There's still a little bit of sort of screech, a little bit of distortion, I think, but not too bad. This is what we call a brown wax cylinder. And now we have the 1901 recording. It's an exceptionally clean disc, I must say. And the restoration is a joy. Does it have the same depth as the cylinder? You're not sure. I should have made it a little bit louder. Maybe you'll change your mind when we get to the big finish. But John doesn't want to go that loud. One thing I'll tell you is these early products of the Victor company are extremely loud. They have a lot of power. Well, in any event, you may prefer the cylinder sound, but we're getting better. There's an ever-improving quality with the discs. But now he's got to solve the problem of scale, the question of mass reproducing records. And I could get maybe my lab assistant, Mr. Feaster, here to help me show you very, very quickly the process that is used in stamping out Igor Feaster. So the way it works is it's a five-step process, right? Or 4 steps. You have 5 different units. So what you have here is, we're going to make believe. Would you hold this? You can talk into it.
Hello.
So let's say this is a wax disc. We're going to record into it. We're going to etch into it with the acoustic process. And theoretically, you could play it. But what we're going to do is we're going to make believe that this is a metal plate that has been chemically adhered to this original. So the first one is a positive. When we remove this electroplating, thank you, this is going to be destroyed, unfortunately, but now we have what we call a father. And the father is a negative. So you can't play that, right? So we're going to press that again. Thank you. And now we have a positive again. And this is a mother. But we're not done. The mother will give birth to a son or daughter, depending. Okay? And we go ahead and put the mother down, take this one. And that's another negative. And that's the last metal part that we need. Now, this is a piece of shellac that is rolled out. We stamp it. This is what comes to you as the consumer. Okay? 5, it's the 5th one, right? And it's not that much loss of quality. But what this means is that when they need more, they can stamp more out. When the stampers wear out, they can go back to the mother and make more stampers. And God forbid the mothers wear out before the demand for the record, they can actually go back to the father and make a couple more mothers. So you keep the original safe and work from the other ones. So that's what I would call, consistency, ever-increasing consistency. If you want to go buy the same record again, you could do it. Really, the last big deal, I think, I know this is important to a lot of people here, is the matter of repertoire. The cylinder concerns had gotten a little stale in what they were offering. And it's not that Edison didn't branch out into ethnic markets or high art music, it's just he was rarely the first. The Victor people and their British counterparts recognized the way to promote their format was to offer broader fare to reach a larger audience. The gramophone company backers invested heavily in so-called recording expeditions into the territories and learned that local audiences wanted to hear their own voices. And the rest of us were interested in learning about them. Victor's real coup, though, was signing Italian tenor Enrico Caruso. Oh, there he was. He had already gone there. He was the most popular star in the world. He gave respectability to the operation. And, you know, let's face it, the gramophone and the phonograph were really still toys. They needed something to give them respectability and taxing privileges when they were claiming that they were educating the masses, not merely entertaining them. But that did mean that they might serve as loss leaders when the real sellers were, you know, popular artists like banjoist Wes Osman or Billy Murray, who was the major interpreter of George M. Cohan. Final innovation that clinched the disc's domination of the field will seem obvious to you all. In 1908, the economically struggling Columbia, second to Edison in cylinders, second to Victor in discs, introduced the double-sided disc. It was a meteoric game changer. All at once, they gave the consumer twice the music for the same price. Edison introduced its 4-minute cylinder, but this was just one selection drawn out over 4 minutes. Victor dutifully followed Columbia, went double-sided as well, and within a few years, the cylinder was pretty much dead. So this is what I would call an ever-refining design. Discs could be bigger or smaller, depending on need, single or double, and with microgroove technology, which came in a few years, you could fit more and more onto a side. But that's a story to be told by our friend Nick Bergh, who will address the advances of the 1920s after we bid farewell to the acoustic era by listening to an original Caruso from 1920. Thank you.
Maybe this one's cracked up.
All right. So electric recording. The basic components of electric recording were available fairly early. You know, the Bell transmitter, receiver. They're working on radio and the tube. But at the same time that was developing, acoustic recording just kept improving over the decades. So, by the 20s, it was almost 3 decades of experimenting and improving, and then it had become very sophisticated. So, mixing multiple horns together, changing the diaphragm, smaller diaphragms, different ways to pivot the stylus. It was all meticulously done. And so it would take quite an impressive electrical system to get even to what they were doing acoustically. But the studios all essentially did some experimentation electric recording fairly early. This is probably the first released recording. This is a Columbia done in the UK. This is at the Abbey, and it's a good example of something you couldn't really record acoustically because you couldn't get close enough to the performer. So essentially, it required something. With the microphone, you could pull back and still be able to record. So this is an example, and you can hear the how crude it is compared to even the acoustic recording we just heard. Let's see if this works here. Oops. So it wasn't surprising that when Bell Labs was showing the major studios about electric recording, they said, "Oh, we've already tried it. It's going nowhere. The acoustic stuff is much better." But they didn't really realize kind of like the level that AT&T and Bell Labs were working, and so they weren't really after like just any electric recording. They were investigating the best way to do things, so the best microphone possible, the best way to amplify the sound, and the best way to cut the record. So these are the same people that eventually brought us the laser and the cell phone and the solar cell. It was the idea factory essentially. They had originally gotten into microphones and communication during the war, World War I, through aircraft, because it's hard to use like a telegraph in an airplane, so it was easier to speak to the microphone and get down to the ground. And so that was their initial kind of experimentation. And then it was continued after the war, kind of just by a group there that was into recording and into music and such. And so this is a very early example of their first experiments of the systems. This is 1920. And you can see how far they are at that point.
Now, landsmen all, whoever you may be, if you want to climb to the top of the tree, if your soul isn't fettered to an office stool, remember to be guided by this golden rule. Stick close to your desk and never go to sea, and you all may be rulers of the Queen Navy. Stick close to your desk and never go to sea, and you all may be rulers of the Queen Navy.
So this is the main components of the electric system. So the single microphone, a condenser microphone, is the first microphone. We still use condenser microphones today. It was a 6-foot amplifier rack and then a cutting head to go on the lathes. So this is kind of the beginning of our entire industry now. This is where rack units come from, and the size of racks and level meters and all this. Patch bays you find in studios today all come from this original system. So right around this same time, radio broadcasting became much higher quality. So the original radio broadcasting was kind of like speech quality, but by 1925, it was higher quality, and it started to become competition to the phonograph. And so they became a lot more interested in switching over. So this shows the conversion. So they actually were able to use their same acoustic recording lathes. You see on the left, this is a Victor machine that recorded the thing you just heard. And then on the right side is the same machine with the acoustic head removed and the electric head put in its place, and then the amplifiers in the back there. So it was a fairly smooth transition because they already knew how to duplicate the records, they already knew how to make the wax, and it was really just about adding this new system. And here is the guts of the cutting head, electric cutting head. It was a very well thought out system. that required a very small amount of power to cut a very high quality groove in the record. And this continued to be used for decades after this. So this 25 technology continued to be used after the war even. And here's a well-known set of photos that Victor took of their concert orchestra in an acoustic setting. And you can see how awkwardly everything's arranged with the big horn, and then again with the microphone that you saw, the box Western Electric microphone. And now they're in a natural setting, and the orchestras could be larger, and there are a lot of big advantages that came with that. So another thing that happened, along with bigger orchestras and being able to record out and about, is you could really record music that you couldn't record before. And for acoustic recording, needed loud music all the time. You couldn't really have soft music. So it was the beginning of being able to record blues and jazz and crooners, and all this came along with electric recording. So this is a quick example of a field. This is early electric 1927 of blues. So it's also important to mention the same system was used for the first film sound recording. And so the first film sound was on disc as well. And this is where the 33 1/3 came from. It enabled a single film reel to fit on one disc. And also, somewhat relevant, so on the left side there is the disc machine that was used for film sound to synchronize with the film cameras. And on the right side is the modern Neumann lathe that also dates back to the late 20s, but it was heavily influenced by this original Western Electric lathe, and is a very direct copy of this very old machine. And this is still the machine used today. So by 28, about 3 years later, they had really defined a very elaborate, sophisticated system. So even at this time, they had, multiple microphones in a mixer. They could record multiple tracks in the film sound system. And, this became essentially the blueprint for the decades to come. And so still, into the 50s, this kind of layout and gain structure continued to be used. And so even though companies like RCA, got into the game at this point, they're essentially copying what was done by Western Electric. And it was all leased equipment. So the companies had to pay a royalty on each record they sold. And they didn't like this, especially during the Depression years. And so all the commercial music studios eventually, went away from the Western Electric system and developed their own and such. So this is, the RCA kind of system. Was similar. They started to use ribbon microphones, but same basic, cutting head and everything from that time. So this kind of divorce happened between Bell Labs, Western Electric, and the music studios. So they continued to evolve and develop, but that technology was really only used for motion picture use as well as broadcasting. And so things were very highly evolved by the late 30s, but the studios didn't really have access to a lot of that technology. So I'm going to talk about after the war, but first we're going to play on the credenza machine, an early electric on a wind-up phonograph. Great. Thank you. So as I mentioned, during this period in the 30s, a lot of developments happened that didn't really make it to the commercial world. So this is the beginning of vinyl records, 33 1/3 records, lacquer discs were developed during this time. Stereo records were first came out during this time. Feedback cutting heads. So all this technology was going on, but didn't really get to the consumer yet. And so this was all kind of set up for after the war. Oops, sorry. So after the war, the major studios essentially realigned with Western Electric, and that kind of technology that was being developed in the 30s became usable again. So this is, essentially late 30s technology that was cutting edge then in the late 40s for the record industry. And the same system was used at Columbia as well as Victor. And then two things came in that weren't straight from Bell Labs. One was the tape recorder came from Germany. So Bell Labs had a stereo AC tape machine in the late 30s, but the modern tape machine they're using now, comes from the German design. And the second big thing that happened was hot stylus. And so this now enabled the lacquer disc to record as well as wax. And you could record long sides on a 12-inch disc and go to the inner diameters and still record at a very high quality. So all these things kind of came together. Here's a picture of the American tape machine. It's the Ampex. So these would come together in the first Columbia LP, 1948. And now they're using the Scully lathe. And so the first LP was this one here, I believe, the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto. And so before this, it would have been an album of discs to be able to get the same amount of material on the one record. So RCA did, play around with long-playing records in the early 30s, but didn't go anywhere. The playback technology was not quite there, and it was just kind of before its time. The playback equipment was really the limiting thing. But RCA quickly followed the Columbia LP with their EP and their 45, and in a much smaller size. And just real quick, another interesting thing that happened after the war was a lot of these, in the 20s and 30s, a lot of studio engineers were kind of, brought up through the studios themselves. And all of a sudden after the war, there was engineers coming back who were trained by the military, Signal Corps and all these places. And so a lot of these people ended up independent studios. So a lot of famous engineers, Bill Putnam and Robert Fine and Tom Dowd. So they started to kind of be able to break away and build these independent studios away from Columbia and Victor and that sort of thing. And it's helpful to kind of go back to something that Rich was talking about initially to understand the next developments of the record, which is that the original home cylinder machine was essentially like a studio recording machine. There's not a lot of difference, except they added a flywheel in the recording machine. But really, the cylinder machine is built to make a recording, and it's a very clever way to make home recordings. So even though Edison had the option to commercialize the disc or the cylinder, it's much easier to make a recording at home on a cylinder than it is on a disc. And so that's why he developed this machine initially. So it's the opposite of the case with the disc, where it's very difficult to make a disc recording, and it's really the domain of the studio, and it would be very hard to make a machine do that at home. And so one of the reasons is the idea of the lead screw, and this becomes important in the later LP era, is so with a cylinder, it's built to record, and so it has a lead screw that's advancing the cutting head and the playback head, whereas the disc, it's actually the groove itself, so nothing's propelling the stylus. It's the actual groove, the stylus sitting in the groove that's moving the stylus along. And so what this means is whatever you make the groove do, the stylus is just going to follow. There's nothing there on the machine to force it to do anything. So you can change, let's see an example here. Yeah, so this is an example of variable pitch. So now because the disc is not being commanded to go anywhere, you can make it do anything you want. So on the left side, you can see the grooves are very close together, and on the right side, very far apart. So what they can do is if the recording gets loud or there's lots of bass, they can separate the grooves so they don't run into each other. And all of a sudden, you can get a lot more runtime. You can increase the level, you can increase the fidelity. And so this technology came in the mid-1950s, and still in the tube era, and but it worked incredibly well. And this is a core technology that's still used today. So long as varying the pitch, it also varies the depth as well. So that you don't skip out of the groove. There's a lot of bass. The depth of the groove will go deeper. To help with that. And so magnetic recording continued to improve, through the 50s. There's a lot of home machines, and eventually they even released commercial music on reel-to-reel. And it was often the same recording you'd be able to get on an LP, but just on reel instead. But they were a lot more expensive. You couldn't really find a track. You had to rewind the tape, and you had to search for a track. With the LP, it's essentially non-linear. You can move anywhere you want quickly. And so these didn't really take off, and the LP continued to be the dominant, the main format at the time. And then lastly in this era is the stereo record, which started in the 1930s, but really didn't get commercialized until the late 50s, largely because of playback technology had to really catch up. And the way this works is that the left groove is actually going at an angle at 45 degrees, and the right groove is also going at 45 degrees, and you put them together, and you get stereo. So by the late 50s, all the core components of the modern LP that you buy in the store were there, essentially. We're still using lacquer masters with a heated stylus. Now it's usually from digital, but the tape recording master continued for many decades into the 80s and 90s. RIAA equalization standards, the variable pitch and depth, as I mentioned, and stereo cutting. And then along with that, there was kind of like the hi-fi era at home, and so the cartridges became a lot better, lower distortion, lower noise. And so by the early 60s, things were in place to make very long albums with a lot of level and still very high quality. And now, thank you. I think we're going to play an example now of an LP. Yeah. Yeah, great.
I don't know how I'm going to stop a Coltrane cut in the middle.
Great, thank you. I'm going to hand it over to Patrick now to take over.
Thanks, Nick. So the LP gave us a longer playing time, but how did this actually end up getting used? Sure, longer musical works, such as symphonies, could now be presented without intrusive interruptions. But 3 or 4 minutes had already been enough time for presenting whole popular songs. Still, popular songs on 70 RPM disc had sometimes been packaged in a way that lent itself to the new LP format. Did you ever wonder where this word album comes from, as in, say, here's an online ranking of every Taylor Swift album from best to worst. In Latin, album simply means something white. But over time, it also came to mean a blank book with empty white pages, which someone could use to collect written messages from their friends. When it became more fashionable to exchange photographs, that same word album was borrowed to mean a book made up of empty pockets for holding those photographs. And at first, a record album simply extended that same idea to 78 RPM discs. It was a book of empty sleeves for holding discs, any discs you as a consumer might want to store together and put on a shelf. But record companies also began using albums to package specific sets of related 78s together for sale as a unit. Maybe the parts of a symphony, maybe all the songs from a particular musical, or maybe just a bunch of discs by the same musician. And when the LP came along, it wasn't just the albums of symphonies that made the jump to the new format, but these other albums too. At first, the connection with physical albums like this remained pretty strong. When a company released a new album, they typically release it both as multiple 78s stored in sleeves and as a single LP disc. To make it clear to users where different selections started on an LP, in case someone wanted to play just one particular song, the industry left a wider space between a couple rotations of the groove spiral to leave a band that reflects light differently and can easily be seen. This way, users could look at an LP, its track listing, identify the number for a particular track, count the tracks on the disc using these visible bands, and drop the stylus into the space before the track they wanted to hear. On an early popular LP, the tracks were fairly consistent in width and length because each one corresponded straightforwardly to one side of a 78 RPM disc. But by the 60s, 78 RPM albums were no longer a thing, and albums, so-called, were coming out only on LP. The term album had become one of those curious words that's mostly lost its original literal meaning and taken up a new one, like cliches and stereotypes, which originally referred to printing processes, or of getting sidetracked, which comes from railroad terminology. When this sort of thing happens, it's usually a good indication that some new concept has taken root that needed a name. And just in case you think I'm getting sidetracked, the term album seems to reflect a concept of exactly this type, because the album itself soon came to be treated as, at least potentially, a new genre of creative work, and not just a format for presenting existing works or packaging songs together for convenience and efficiency. Think of the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, or Pink Floyd's The Wall. These are coherent, long-form, creative audio works of a new and unprecedented type. Individual tracks might now vary greatly in length, maybe including long extemporaneous solos. Tracks might not have any silence between them, but might merge seamlessly into one another, even though their divisions are still marked by these visually distinctive bands. Radio adapted to these new long-form audio works in turn with the introduction of the AOR, or album-oriented rock format. Meanwhile, the sleeves or jackets used to store LP albums evolved into canvases for elaborate complementary visual art, many of which have become as iconic as the music itself. In 1977, when the two spacecraft, Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, were about to be launched on a journey that would ultimately send them into interstellar space, the idea came up of attaching to each of them a message from the people of Earth to any future extraterrestrial civilization that might discover them. And the format chosen for this purpose was none other than the Microgroove LP. These aren't typical LPs, it's true. They're formed from gold-plated copper with an estimated lifespan of around 500 million years. And they contain audio tracks at 16 rather than 33 RPM, along with still images encoded through audio. But otherwise, we're talking standard LPs, containing spoken messages and music that would play perfectly well on an ordinary modern turntable. Voyager 1 entered interstellar space in 2012 and is now the furthest human-made object from Earth at a current distance of a little over 15 billion miles. And the idea that a distant future alien intelligence could figure out what to do with the disk on Voyager 1 really isn't all that far-fetched. If you look closely at the groove, either of a microgroove LP or of an older coarse groove 78, maybe even putting it under a microscope, you'll see that it's a wavy line, coiled into a tight spiral, a graph of back and forth, back and forth sound vibrations over time. That wavy line groove has been a common thread running through the whole story we've been presenting here. It goes straight back to Emil Berliner, and even beyond, back to the phonograms recorded as visible graphs on paper by Edouard Léon Scott de Martinville back in the 1850s and 1860s, before anyone had yet grasped the idea of playback. This has become the default way of imagining what a sound should look like. People often seem to ascribe a symbolic value to the shape if we're to judge from the number of artists on Etsy who offer to sell you a frameable paper print of the waveform of your favorite song, or from the small but apparently successful sound waveform tattoo business. In the early 1980s, a man named Arthur Lintgen, anyone? Made the news for his ability to identify classical music compositions just by looking at the grooves of LPs. As Lintgen told a New York Times reporter, "I have a knowledge of musical structure and of the literature, and I can correlate this structure with what I see. Loud passages reflect light differently. In the grossest terms, they look silvery. Record companies spread the grooves in forte passages. They have a more jagged, sawtooth look. Soft passages look blacker." Now, he was pretty good at this, but even I can tell the difference between visually between louder and softer passages on an LP in exactly the way Lintgen described. If works of classical music have a distinctive large-scale pattern of dynamics, then there's no reason why someone familiar enough with the canon shouldn't be able to recognize those patterns by eye. You can tell a surprising amount just from looking at the surface of an LP as you count those bands to decide where to drop the needle, which is all pretty cool. Now, Rich has talked about how the disc triumphed over the cylinder in the early 20th century, largely because it was more convenient and took up less space. The LP's main competitors over the past 50 years have become even more convenient and taken up even less space, but at the expense of making the link between sounds and physical forms increasingly invisible, complicated, and unintuitive. In the 1970s, there was the audio cassette. You couldn't play an LP to listen to while you went out jogging, but thanks to the eminently portable Walkman unveiled at the end of that decade, you could go jogging while listening to an audio cassette. But the audio is encoded on the tape as variations in magnetism. You can't tell by looking at the tape with your naked eye whether there's anything recorded on it, much less what it is. And the mechanism's hidden during playback unless you count being able to watch the two reels turning slowly around through a transparent plastic window. In the 1980s, there was the CD, or compact disc, which is a disc, just as an LP is. There's a physical object there you can hold in your hand or collect or give someone as a present, but it's a digital format manifested in numbers, not an analog one manifested in shapes. And the specific process by which a digital audio stream is encoded through differently reflected pits and lands with the data scrambled out of order on purpose to help conceal errors in playback is mind-bendingly complicated. And even then, there's nothing to see with the naked eye on the surface of a CD, except that you can usually make out how much has been recorded. Loud and soft passages look exactly the same, which is to say, like a mirror in which you see only yourself. There are no visible divisions between tracks used for navigation. To get to a specific track, you just push a button and the machine finds it for you somehow. In the 1990s, there was the MP3 file. An iPod can hold vast numbers of MP3s, so not only could you go out jogging while listening to your favorite album, you can take a whole audio library along with you. An MP3 still has a kind of physical existence on a drive, and you can collect and keep MP3s, but they're no longer tied to distinct physical objects you can touch and see. And since each MP3 typically corresponds to a single or to one track on an LP, MP3s foster an a la carte approach to selections, sometimes associated with an impending death of the album, which might be a downside depending on how you feel about albums as coherent creative works. In the 2000s, we saw the proliferation of streaming services for both audio and video. It might make more sense to compare audio streaming services with radio than with record players and iPods, but let's talk about them anyway. If what you want is to be surrounded constantly by music you like as a kind of background soundtrack to your life, they're probably the most convenient option yet, but also the least tangible. The digital files now live off in the cloud someplace. If a service shuts down, or if licensing agreements aren't renewed, your favorite song could go away. Many people might be perfectly happy with this scenario, but not those who value the ability to build up a personal collection of sound recordings over years and decades, to seek out the obscure or the undiscovered or the underappreciated, and not to let go of it once you've found it. And if that's what you care about, what format has the most to recommend it? I'd argue that the LP is more in harmony with these values and anxieties than any of the alternatives, and I'd like to run through some of the reasons why. As a display object, the LP offers a more gratifying size for album cover art than the CD, with its smaller jewel case. And the disc itself is straightforward and comprehensible. Anyone can look at its wavy line groove and, with a little explanation, understand basically how it works. I mean, you could spin it while holding a sewing needle in the groove with a cone of paper attached to the needle's other end and get meaningful sound. Back in 1977, when the Voyager spacecraft were launched, the people in charge apparently believed the LP format was transparent enough that an alien intelligence millions of years from now ought to be able to figure it out with the help of a few diagrams. You couldn't say that about a CD or an MP3 file. Even now, in the year 2023, if we were going to launch another one of these interstellar messages, we'd probably do better to send an LP. It's possible to sit and listen in a focused way to a CD or a folder full of MP3 files, as one might watch a film in a focused way, rather than treating it as mere background music. But the album on LP almost requires a more focused mode of listening because it demands more constant attention. In this spirit, activities that might once have seemed a nuisance are now framed positively by enthusiasts in terms of ritual, they like to say, removing the disc from its sleeve, cleaning it, turning it over to play the second side. You can't just set your turntable going and forget about it for an hour or two while you go about something else, as you can with an iPod or Spotify. But if your whole attention is focused on the listening experience, that's not a problem. Here, one change in LP technology might be revealing. Decades ago, turntables often came with automatic record changers so that you could stack up several discs, which the mechanism would automatically drop onto the platter and play one after another. It's wonderfully convenient. As far as I'm aware, record changers are no longer being manufactured. Some say this is because people grew concerned about them damaging records. But another explanation might be that changing records is something consumers of LPs now value doing for themselves as one part of a ritual of focused listening. Speaking of changing records, I'd now like to thank you for your kind attention and turn the floor back over to John Levin.
I think actually we're going to see if we had any questions.
Well,
Sure, we
first.
can do that first. I would love to invite questions from the room. If you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you. If you have a question over Zoom, just please pop it into the Zoom chat. As we're waiting for questions to come in, I wanted to kind of expand on this thread you're making, Patrick, between, taking and examining all the senses as you experience, taking a record off of a shelf, looking at it, looking at all of its artwork, taking the record out of the sleeve, and actually putting it onto the turntable and having worked at a record label and seen the popularity of colored vinyl and then die-cut vinyl, I love that you're pulling together all of these sensory components into the actual experience of listening to an LP and how that has contributed to its sustainability. And I think another aspect of that, even as a child of the 80s, is to go back and look at DJ culture and turntablists and hip hop. And I wanted you to, kind of expand on that idea of your sensory experience and talk about really the emergence of that genre of music, but a large factor of it is due to the LP record, right?
Sure. So with DJ turntabling, I think some people might ask what the connection is with the LP. Particularly when nowadays you might see someone using a computer as their instrument, but in terms of a style of music, a genre, and so forth, the connection between turntables and turntabling is kind of like the connection between violins and violin music. It's very, very tightly connected. The sounds of scratching and so forth are native to the LP, whereas now there are certainly efforts to simulate all of these effects digitally, but on the LP, you can create them naturally, just in the way that they originated. And it's not just turntabling either. There are many sounds associated with the mechanism of an LP that have become iconic tropes. So just thinking, for example, of the sound of an LP with the motor turned off and it gradually slows down to a stop. You hear that in soundtracks all the time, just as an indication that something is suddenly grinding and slowing to a stop. Or this sound of a sudden scratch across a record in the middle of a musical piece, which is often used in a scene in a TV show where someone has suddenly said something shocking and everybody stops talking and turns and looks at them. And these are all things that can be simulated digitally, but with the LP, these sounds and these processes are at home. So I think as long as these tropes are part of our culture, the LP will have to be as well.
All right, well, Rich had mentioned quality, and I wanted to kind of turn the mic back to you and to talk about, even though consumers have arguably better quality ways to purchase their music, do you agree with Patrick, or do you have other thoughts about the continued popularity of LPs? And
is it still on? Well, that's an odd one because we nearly lost the ability to make records, right? I mean, in the whatever 20, 30 years that they weren't making vinyl, the people who knew how to do it died off. And so getting back online, and all the plants shut down and parts were salvaged. So actually we're lucky that the format was saved in time so that we didn't completely lose all that knowledge, but it took some time. And I think most people in here, I've noticed a lot of people nodding along, so I think we have some experienced vinyl listeners in here. And the quality over these last 20 years has been a mixed bag. The mastering, the cutting, right? You know, you heard a couple of, you heard that Coltrane on that Heavy Atlantic from the 60s, and that just knocked it out of the park, right? So, and I bet a lot of people in this room could tell the difference between something that was pressed in the 50s and the 60s versus something that was pressed today. So there's always hope, but it's never a straightforward, automatic given, right? I mean, I do not just run out and buy the newest remaster of a classic album. I usually ask the question, what was wrong with my original Fragile by Yes? It sounds pretty good to me. Why do I want a new one?
All right, well, I would love to kind of turn the focus to the work that everyone on this panel is doing now in terms of preserving and stewarding all of these different formats that we've talked about today. And I wanted to ask Nick about challenges you faced and also any emerging technologies, techniques, or methods you wanted to mention to folks here tonight.
Sure, yeah. One interesting thing about the record that I'm always impressed about is that how crude it really is as far as what is on that record and how good it's become to sound, and that's because of the decades and decades and millions of dollars the companies have put into developing this technology to cut it and such, and it can be pretty remarkable what a turntable can do and what a cartridge can do these days. And so, I've been involved in developing some optical technology to play, damaged records via laser and things like that. And it's always, surprising how, still today that a excellent phono cartridge is still superior than, very high technology into extracting the same sound from the record. So it's really, just used when there's, damage or problems that can't be done with a stylus, because it's still, it seems like a very crude thing. Like you can buy a cartridge for $50 or $100 or whatever, but what you're really buying is, millions of dollars that were spent over the decades to get to that point to sell a $50 cartridge. And so it would be hard to make something like that from scratch, essentially.
Nick, when you're transferring off of these things, are you using, with the laser, are you using digital to do, are you using digital to transfer, or is it somehow?
Yeah, so if you take, say for example, the biggest issue with optical scanning these days is really in the resolution. So, you can get excellent frequency response, probably better than even a cartridge potentially, but, in the analog domain, we're capturing, maybe around 22 bits or something like that. And most of these optical systems are kind of limited around like 8 bits or so.
To get off, to shine onto the groove and then.
Yeah, I mean,
So
the challenge is really how small that modulation really is in the groove. I mean, you essentially need a microscope to
Right.
see it,
Right.
And because that modulation is so small, the resolution of the optics themselves start to fall apart. Yeah.
What about doing like digital mapping of the groove and then having AI remap the groove and get rid of all all of the damage, and then actually create a new, using like a CNC type of a system to re-etch a new groove plate that you.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of interesting technologies out there now, and a lot of people have tried this stuff, and it's always just surprising at the end of the day how good that little $100 cartridge is.
I
So,
agree. I agree.
It's humbling in a way because
Yeah,
you may
yeah.
spend $10,000 developing something, and all of a sudden it's this thing that's been around that's still quite good.
We all seem to be running away from the digital audio. How are we going to back up all of these things that are analog that there's, you know what I mean? Is there a way that, have you, I don't want to go on too far, but what about this new quantum computing with the qubits? Have you read anything about that? Because digital audio right now is binary. It's either 1 or 0, off or on, and there's this new technology called qubit where it could be spin and it could be an analog waveform in a digital computer. There's a paper on it. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot of, great developments right now, but I think a lot of it, ends up, being with increased storage and such, because we are pretty sophisticated in our ways now to be able to extract this audio.
Yeah.
And so it's really just about, storing it and
Interesting.
such often, so.
Well, I won't waste any more of your time. I find it interesting. Thank you.
I love that one of our Zoom attendees has just simply stated analog is the backup. So unfortunately, we are out of time for questions. I do want to wrap things up and pass things back to John.
Well, I wanted to do sort of a level set on the presentation, and then David's got a couple of closing comments. I wanted to read you a quote that was from a 1995 interview. This guy says, "The biggest distorter is the LP itself. I've made thousands of LP masters. I used to make 17 a day with 2 lathes going at the same time, and I'm glad to see the LP go. As far as I'm concerned, good riddance. It was a constant battle to try and make music sound the way it should. It was never any good. And if people don't like what they hear in digital, they should blame the engineer who did it. Blame the mastering house. Blame the mixing engineer. That's why some digital sound recordings are terrible, and I'm not denying that they do, but don't blame digital." The guy who said that is Rudy Van Gelder, who for 50 years was one of the, sort of the reigning recordist of jazz music. And I wanted to read this because I wanted to make clear that after everything this panel has talked about today, about the joys and endurance of discs and analog sound, I hope everybody in this room knows that all of us here are digital-centric people, that we rely on all these exquisite digital tools that are being given to us that we could take advantage of that weren't around even a few years ago. And I just think it's important for you to know that. Just wanted to say it. David?
Thanks, John. So where does that leave us? In closing, I'd like to circle back to the mission of the UCSB Library and the goals of the Early Recordings Initiative. Take a look at what we call the petting zoo over there, all of the 130 years of analog formats. Probably, my guess is the better part of 80% of those recordings only exist on those commercial issues that you see on the table. The masters of many likely have been lost or destroyed. It's easy to blame people in the past for lacking a mindset of historical preservation. And it is true that the record companies discarded masters as taste changed and when recordings were no longer thought to be commercially viable. And it's hard to blame those that recycled metal parts for scrap metal during World War II. It's a little easier to blame those responsible for the Los Angeles warehouse fire in 2007 that torched over 100,000 masters owned by the Universal Music Group. But we shouldn't put blame solely in the past without taking an active role in preserving things in the present. Our panelists today are all intimately involved on a daily basis with the preservation and dissemination of unique and rare sound recordings. I'm grateful for them for taking the time to share their knowledge with us today and for the work that they do. I learn from these folks all the time. I've had many conversations with them that inform our practice here at the UCSB Library. And it's our goal at the UCSB Library through the Early Recordings Initiative to become active stewards of our recorded sound heritage. It's our responsibility to preserve and make accessible these recordings for current and future generations to study and enjoy. Thanks for coming. And Heather has the closing remarks here.
I promise I really am the last person to speak tonight, and that's because I'm Heather Silva, and I'm the development director here at the library. And I do want to thank everyone again for their participation tonight in this panel, and to David for his work and expertise in this area. The Early Recordings Initiative has been really substantial in helping to promote our historic recorded sound collection. And one of the things that John and David worked on this summer in partnership with the Library of Congress is creating a couple of videos around cylinders. The first one is called Cylinder Identification, Know It Before You Play It. And the second one is Playing It Safe, Transferring and Protecting Cylinders. And they're currently in post-production right now, videos, but we will be pushing them out soon, and we'll make sure that all of you have access to them. And we also have a really interesting cylinder ID guide out here on the table for all of you to pick up, along with information about the Early Recordings Initiative. Another part of the initiative is also acquisitions, and the library recently acquired a really interesting collection of, the Van Epps collection, which is he's an archive. It's an archive of a pioneer recording artist, and he's a banjo musician that was actually donated to us by our friend Nick Bergh. And we're thrilled to have that kind of collection here now at the library. This is a really special place for many of us. I know for myself, it's been a joy to work with people who have such genuine interest in intellectual curiosity and the ability to continue to be lifelong learners, and I'm glad that you all joined us for that tonight as well. I do want to invite you to take part in the initiative, to be a supporter of the library in this particular area. And I want to give one more big thanks again to John Levin for all of his work for tonight and for having us all here together in this room. So thank you, John. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening, and also thanks to all of the Zoom members who are with us here tonight, too.